In the previous two videos, we covered two very important topics. Firstly, the Israeli detention system, how Palestinians are subjected to a separate military law that the Israelis are not subjected to. And in the second video, which we released most recently, we discussed the case of Israeli hostages that were released by the Palestinian resistance and how these hostages seem to have been treated, the narratives that are coming out from some of the videos, etc. And in this video now, we turn our eyes towards the case of the Palestinian prisoners that were recently released by the Israelis. What was their situation? Initially, the Israelis refused to negotiate for their hostages. Immediately after October the 7th, a deal was offered to the Israelis for the release of the Israeli hostages. However, the Israelis refused this deal and attempted to militarily free the hostages from Gaza. It is thought by some that Netanyahu chose to do things this way because of a hardline stance that he wished to maintain. And also the case of his brother, Jonathan, is referred to in Uganda, how he was killed in Entebbe 40 years ago in a commando raid to free Israeli hostages. With the Israeli government's failure to free the hostages from Gaza, pressure started to mount in Israel. And fears were increasing in Israel regarding bombings coming from the Gaza Strip. However, as we saw, this military strategy did not work in freeing the Israeli hostages from the Gaza Strip. Also, there was a fear that the constant bombardment of the Gaza Strip by the Israelis may actually end up killing some of the Israeli hostages. For these reasons, Israel ended up accepting the deal with the Palestinian resistance to trade hostages. With this, though, they would attempt to muffle public expressions of joy that these Israeli hostages are being freed. Minister of National Security Ben-Gvir instructed the police to prevent any celebrations of hostages returning home. A person may wonder why. The purported reasoning for this was in order that there not be any public celebrations of terrorism. He commanded Police Commissioner Kobi Shabtai to use an iron fist against attempts to celebrate prisoner releases or support terrorism. And some may actually find this shocking. In line with this iron fist, this rule against celebrating the release of hostages actually saw Israeli soldiers shooting into crowds of people. When the deputy mayor of Jerusalem was asked whether shooting a teenager during the hostage releases was a right choice to make, she made the excuse that there was an agreement that no celebrations would take place.
I'm answering the
Deputy
question.
Mayor, I'm fully aware of what they've been...
Part of the deal was that there would be no celebrations.
Now let us state some facts. The idea that all of the hostages that were released by the Israelis were terrorists is factually untrue. Around 80% of them were not even charged. And the majority of them were actually held under the administrative detention conditions. We've described this in previous videos. It is where Palestinians can be held by the Israelis for 6 months without trial, without charge, and this period can actually be indefinitely extended. Families then, who had been waiting for years to receive their children home, were barred from celebrating. They were not allowed to celebrate. Here is the case of the mother of Fatina Salman describing her experience when her daughter finally came home.
The Israeli authorities were with us from 2 p.m. They surrounded the house and ripped down the decorations of any display of celebration. They stole the joy of my daughter's release.
And to be completely honest with all of you, there are literally hundreds of stories and testimonies from Palestinians that were held in Israeli captivity. They complain about physical abuse, verbal abuse, psychological abuse, rape, starvation, and we are only going to discuss some of the most heinous cases. For example, we have the case of the child, Mohammed Nazal, who was picked up by the Israeli forces in Jenin around 3 months ago. And of course, this was before October the 7th. He was picked up under the administrative detention procedure. Once he was released, he spoke to the press about how he was beaten in prison and he had both of his arms broken and they did not allow him to see a doctor for a whole week. In an absolutely shocking attempt to refute these claims, the official Israeli account on X would post this video from Nizal's release. And it doesn't seem surprising that a BBC investigation would verify that his hospital records from Ramallah actually show that his arms were broken.
ففاته بلش يضرب في اندزيته على اساس يروح على واحد ثاني ظل يضرب في الفاظ لزق في يضرب في يضربني على راسي اخذ براسي ظهري مشوه ايدي مكسرات.
Mohammed is still imprisoned by his injuries, needing help to eat, drink and go to the bathroom, he says.
His body clearly bruised from the beating that he received by Israeli officials. We also have the very sad case of Basil Adia, who was imprisoned at the age of 15. His family mentioned that when he was imprisoned, or before he was imprisoned, he had no psychological issues at all. But now, 11 years after being behind bars, he suffers gravely from memory loss. 6 years he spent in solitary confinement. We have this next case, absolutely shocking, Mansour Shahatit, who spent 10 years in solitary confinement. For 7 years, he was not allowed to see his father. When he was released by the Israeli officials, he could not recognize his family. Ramzi Abbasi spoke of all manners of abuse and degradation. He says prisoners were raped, bones were broken, access to water was provided for only 1 hour a day. Some would be deprived of sunlight for months, and soldiers would rip and urinate on Qur'ans. This is abuse specifically against the religion of those kidnapped. Similarly, Abdul Rahman Hamid discusses how he was forced to drink alcohol by Israeli officials.
كنا بدنا مي كنا جندي كانوا جبلنا كنية كبيرة كنا نشرب ما رضيناش نشرب طاسة يضرب فينا وخلانا نشرب غصبا عن احنا.
We also have the case of Isra Jabis. In 2015, she was at a military checkpoint. She alerted the soldiers that there's a strange smell coming from her car. And this was caused by an engine failure in the car, which caused a fire to erupt. The officer present forcefully kept the door of the car shut, and she suffered third-degree burns as a result of this. You may think someone like this deserves sympathy, right? She was actually accused of attempting a bombing, branded a terrorist, and imprisoned. And throughout her sentence, she was denied proper medical treatment and even denied access to pain relief. And after 8 years, on the 25th of November, she would finally be released. She would finally be made free. And despite the heavy presence of police outside her home, she was reunited with her family. In all honesty, there are many stories that we could share with you, and hardly any of them would differ from those that we have shared with you today. Now, we must be objective here, and we have to ask a question. If these types of narratives, these horrific narratives, or narratives that are even half as horrific as these, were coming out of the mouths of those Israeli hostages released by the Palestinian resistance, what would the reaction of Israelis be all around the world? What would the reaction of the world be towards the Palestinian resistance? There would be horror. People would be tweeting these things all over. The news would be reporting on these things, right? So Palestinian activists will then ask the following question, and that is, why the double standard? Are Palestinian lives worth less than Israeli lives? Are Palestinian hostages different than Israeli hostages? Why the double standard? These are all questions that Palestinian activists will ask to the world, who seemingly treats Israeli hostages differently to Palestinian hostages. And finally, it should be noted that during this entire truce period, the Israelis have arrested just as many Palestinians as they actually released. To conclude, human rights advocates will ask the question, how can we have long-term peace when these grievances of Palestinians are ignored? They are not addressed. No one is talking about them.